An overdraft isn't a character flaw, it's a contract. For a private individual to spend year after year more money than they receive, a specific set of things has to happen. A bank has to extend the facility, someone has to authorize the arrangement, suppliers have to keep delivering while their invoices sit unpaid, and a household staff has to administer the whole thing, placing the orders, taking the calls, knowing exactly which tradesman is being asked to wait this month. The Queen Mother's finances have been rehearsed in almost every account of her life and explained in none of them. The figure arrives, somebody raises an eyebrow, and then it's gone. But the figure is the least interesting part. The interesting part is the machinery. Who said yes, who absorbed the shortfall, and who, in that building, picked up the telephone to a supplier who wanted paying and had to find something to say. Those people existed. Some of them are on the record. Clarence House, London. 50 years of it, from shortly before the coronation in 1953 until March 2002. 4 stories of pale render on the Mall, Grade 1 listed, designed by John Nash in 1825. For half a century, it was Elizabeth Bowes Lyon's primary working base, the place where she received guests, managed correspondence, maintained a household, and, as the authorized biographer William Shawcross put it in his 2009 official biography, ran up what he called inevitable financial shortfalls even after her civil list annuity reached £643,000 a year. That annuity is where the income side of this story begins, and it begins further back than most accounts suggest. The common assumption is that the Queen Mother's parliamentary provision dates from 1952, from her husband's death and the accession of her daughter. It does not. The statutory basis was Section 3 of the Civil List Act 1937, which granted her, as Queen Consort, a yearly sum of £70,000 charged on the Consolidated Fund. When King George VI died on 6 February 1952, and the new Civil List Act was drawn up for Queen Elizabeth II, Parliament didn't repeal Section 3 of the 1937 Act. The Queen Mother's provision continued under its original legislative basis, unchanged at £70,000, for another 2 decades. The Civil List Act 1972 was the first statutory revision. Section 3 of that act explicitly substituted the words £70,000 with £95,000, still a relatively modest sum. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, Treasury supplements authorized under the Civil List Act 1975 pushed the figure upward incrementally. By January 1984, a Hansard written answer records the Royal Trustees recommending an increase from £321,500 to £334,400 for that year. The annuity was rising, but it was rising against expenditure that was rising faster. The step change came in October 1990. The Civil List, Increase of Financial Provision, Order 1990, Statutory Instrument 1990-2018, made its way through Parliament and came into force on 1 January 1991. Article 3 of that order is unambiguous. The yearly sum mentioned in Section 3 of the Civil List Act 1937, provision for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, shall be increased to £643,000. The previous figure of £334,400 was replaced. This wasn't an estimate or a press report. It's a primary statutory instrument, publicly available on legislation.gov.uk. That £643,000 figure remained in place for the rest of her life. The Royal Trustees' 10-year summary confirms it for every year from 1991 through 2001. For 2002, the prorated sum was £159,000. The annuity ceased on her death on 30 March of that year. Now, £643,000 sounds like a substantial income. The question is what it was expected to cover. Parliamentary briefings described the annuity as funding the performance of public duties, staff salaries, household running costs, official entertaining, and travel. It wasn't purely personal income, and it wasn't disaggregated in public documents into those categories. The analogy in the sovereign's own civil list is the first schedule of the 1952 Act, which divides the Queen's provision into privy purse, salaries of the household, expenses of the household, royal bounty and alms, and supplementary provision. An equivalent but less formally documented structure applied to the Queen Mother's establishment. The Independent, in a 1st April 2002 piece on her finances, stated flatly that the £643,000 didn't come close to covering her staff costs. Secondary reconstructions of her late career annual expenditure place total outgoings at approximately £4 million, a figure that should be treated as an informed estimate rather than a verified account, since no official household budget for Clarence House has ever been made public. What the expenditure side contained isn't in serious dispute. The Queen Mother maintained 4 residential establishments throughout her widowhood: Clarence House, her primary London base; Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, her established weekend home from the 1930s; Burke Hall on the Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire, used for approximately 3 weeks each August; and Castle of May in Caithness, her only personally owned property, used approximately 3 weeks in August and 10 days each October. Castle of May has its own brief financial history worth following. She purchased what was then called Barragill Castle in 1952, within months of the King's death. The Castle of May Trust's own documentation confirms the purchase, but does not specify a price. Press tradition holds the figure at approximately £100. The Mirror, the Express, the Daily Mail, and Hello all reproduce variants of this claim, ranging from less than £100 to exactly £100. Hugo Vickers, in his biography of the Queen Mother, provides the more useful observation. The castle was cheap to buy, but not to restore to habitable condition. Whatever the purchase price, the restoration costs were the real expenditure, and their precise funding isn't in the public record. The castle was gifted to the Castle of May Trust in 1996, valued at approximately £1 million at that point. 3 properties beyond Castle of May were maintained under Crown arrangements: Clarence House under a Crown estate lease, Royal Lodge and Burke Hall on royal estates, but their day-to-day staffing and running costs fell on the Queen Mother's household. Each required heating, maintenance, domestic staff on site, and periodic capital expenditure. Running 4 establishments simultaneously across 2 countries is expensive for any private individual. The Queen Mother wasn't any private individual, and the standard expected at each property wasn't ordinary. The staff numbers are confirmed in a range rather than a single figure. Brian Hoey's account of the household refers to approximately 60 domestic staff at Clarence House. When Prince Charles moved into Clarence House after the Queen Mother's death, reports indicated that up to 100 staff faced redundancy. The range across these sources is 50 to 100, depending on what is being counted and when. But at no point in her later decades was the Queen Mother running a lean operation. She never reduced it. The household that existed in the 1960s was, according to Tom Quinn's research on William Tallon, largely unchanged in its structure through the 1990s. Racing was the other major expenditure category, and the one most clearly documented in the authorized biography. The Queen Mother was a significant patron of national hunt racing, jump racing rather than flat, for essentially her entire widowhood. Her trainers over the decades included Peter Cazalet, Fulk Walwyn, and later Nicky Henderson. Walwyn, her principal trainer for much of the period, sent out 5 winners for her in a single season, according to the Cheltenham Festival centenary history. He trained for her until his death in 1991. The 1999 Sunday Express report, which we will come back to in detail, mentioned 10 racehorses in training at that point. National hunt ownership is structurally a loss-making enterprise for almost all owners. Training fees and running costs consistently exceed prize money for the majority of horses. Shawcross's official biography includes, per press coverage of it, letters from the Queen Mother to her treasurer following racing losses, one of which expressed something to the effect of, having lost all his money at Ascot and hoping he didn't mind. The exact wording is reported via book reviews rather than a publicly available primary text, and should be taken as a characterization of the correspondence rather than a verbatim transcript. But the direction of those letters, from owner to treasurer following a loss, confirms the racing was a net cost, not an income stream. Entertaining at Clarence House was substantial. The Queen Mother maintained active lunch and dinner schedules with large guest lists. Her social life was organized around daily hospitality at a scale appropriate to a major royal household, not a private individual. Food, wine, flowers, service staff, all at a standard consistent with the scale of the building and the expectations of the guests. So the income side of the ledger gives us £643,000 per year from 1991 onwards. The expenditure side, staff costs alone, before racing, before the other three residences, before entertaining, apparently exhausted that provision and then some. The gap between the two had to go somewhere. The structure of the Clarence House household in the 1990s was straightforward. At its apex sat two roles that, until 1993, were held by two different people. Lieutenant Colonel Sir Martin Gilliatt was the Queen Mother's private secretary from 1956, a 37-year tenure that covered correspondence, diary management, and the official conduct of the household. Sir Alistair Aird had been Comptroller of the Household since 1974, with explicit responsibility, confirmed by his Telegraph obituary and related charitable records, for her homes, her staff, and her entertaining. When Gilliatt died in 1993, Aird absorbed the private secretary role as well, combining both senior administrative functions in a single person for the final decade of the Queen Mother's life. This matters for understanding how the household's financial position was actually managed. As comptroller from 1974, Aird was the person structurally responsible for authorizing expenditure, managing staff costs, and overseeing the operational relationship between the household and its suppliers. After 1993, he also controlled correspondence and represented the household to the outside world. Brian Hoey's account of the Queen Mother's household contains a specific passage about the comptroller refusing to allocate funds for certain repairs. Direct textual evidence that the comptroller's role involved active financial gatekeeping, not just administration. What Aird himself said about any of this isn't on the public record. No interview, no memoir, no attributed statement from him about creditor management, overdraft authorization, or supplier relations has been located. His role places him structurally at the center of these decisions. His testimony in his own words does not exist in accessible form. Below Aird, the household included equerries, personal attendants responsible for accompanying the Queen Mother and managing her daily schedule. Major Colin Burgess served in that role for approximately 2 years in the mid-1990s and subsequently published a memoir, Behind Palace Doors, in 2006. That book has been characterized across its reviews as an affectionate account of the Queen Mother's personal habits, protocol, and social occasions. Burgess documenting her gin and Dubonnet ritual, her punctuality, her warmth. His role as equerry didn't extend to financial administration, and his memoir does not address unpaid invoices, creditor management, or the mechanics of the household accounts. Secondary sources that describe him as managing the household finances are conflating his role with Aird's. William Tallon, Backstairs Billy, served for over 50 years as page of the Backstairs, Clarence House's most senior domestic servant and the Queen Mother's trusted personal confidant. He entered royal service in the 1950s and remained until her death in 2002. His role was domestic and personal, not financial. Tom Quinn's 2015 biography of Tallon, Backstairs Billy, notes that the Queen Mother was hugely in debt at the time of her death and quotes what various newspaper reports said about the Coutts balance, while explicitly acknowledging those reports were difficult to verify. Quinn's book also contains a passage describing Tallon negotiating with the comptroller, placing the comptroller, meaning heired, as the financial authority figure within the household structure. Which brings us to the overdraft, the figure, and where it actually comes from. The claim that the Queen Mother held a substantial overdraft at Coutts & Co., the Strand-based bank that has served as the royal family's private bank since the 17th century, isn't in serious dispute across the range of published accounts. What is in dispute, if dispute is even the right word, is the precise figure, the date it represents, and the evidentiary chain behind it. The earliest traceable named press report is the Sunday Express, published around March 1999. That report isn't directly accessible in its original form, but it survives via a South China Morning Post article dated 22 March 1999, which summarizes the Sunday Express story and gives the specific figure. An overdraft of £4 million, run up by the 98-year-old Queen Mother at the Royal Bank, Coutts. The Sunday Express attributed this to unnamed royal aides. The same 1999 reporting cycle produced a Chicago Tribune piece describing her as currently facing a debt of $6.5 million, consistent with a dollar conversion of approximately £4 million at 1999 exchange rates. Those 1999 reports also described proposed economies, staff cuts, mothballing one of her residences, selling rarely used cars, selling some of the 10 racehorses, and the possibility of moving her from Clarence House to an apartment at St. James's Palace. None of those economies appear to have been implemented. She remained at Clarence House until her death 3 years later. After her death in March 2002, the £4 million figure circulated widely in British broadsheets, The Guardian, The Independent, The Daily Telegraph, all referencing a £4 million Coutts overdraft. The Guardian's obituary feature on 31 March 2002 is the source of the remark attributed to the Queen. Coutts would have folded long ago but for Mummy's overdraft. That is a press anecdote without a primary transcript. The Guardian's April 3 analysis piece is more careful, stating explicitly that the overdraft was reported in 1999 to run to £4 million, tracing the figure to the original press coverage rather than presenting it as new information. The BBC's Business News Online, in contemporary coverage, noted that Coutts was hurt by criticism that it allowed the Duchess of York to run up debts of more than £3 million and the Queen Mother an overdraft of £4 million. The figure has since been repeated in Time magazine, The Daily Express, The Daily Telegraph, and The Guardian's July 2023 coverage of the Farage banking controversy, each time attributing it to what was reported at the time of her death, not to a bank statement or court record. A higher figure, £7 million, appears in Tom Quinn's Backstairs Billy, published in 2015, but Quinn himself flags that this derives from newspaper reports he acknowledges are difficult to verify. The £7 million isn't anchored to a specific date or banking document, and it does not appear in contemporaneous mainstream UK press. No Coutts statement, no probate inventory, no court record confirming an exact overdraft balance has entered the public domain. The Queen Mother's will was sealed by High Court order in April 2002, standard practice for senior royals, and all estate figures in press coverage are press estimates. The Queen inherited the estate, estimated by the press at £50 to £70 million, under the 1993 tax agreement that exempts bequests from the Queen Mother to the sovereign from inheritance tax. The mechanics of how any debt was settled within that estate structure aren't in the public legal or parliamentary record. William Shawcross, in his 2009 authorized biography, is the most authoritative published voice on the subject, and what he says, as reported in Telegraph coverage of the book, is carefully bounded. He attributes the debts to inevitable financial shortfalls, even after the annuity reached £643,000. He states that the Queen covered her mother's racing losses and other expenses, the phrase used in press coverage of the book, to enable her to continue the style of life to which she was both accustomed and suited. The accessible summaries and reviews of Shawcross's 1,200-page biography don't show him naming Coutts explicitly, publishing a precise death date balance, or specifying the mechanism by which the Queen cleared any debts. His account of her finances, even as relayed by reviewers, is directional rather than documentary. The Guardian review of the biography states simply, "For the Queen Mother," writes William Shawcross, "she was deeply in debt most of the time." The LA Times review notes, "Reported millions in bank overdrafts, some of it from her passion for racing and betting," and describes her attitude to money as exhibiting what it calls a certain insouciance. These are characterizations of the biography, not excerpts from it. So the evidentiary chain for the central claim runs as follows. An anonymous royal aide spoke to the Sunday Express in March 1999. That story circulated internationally. The Guardian and other broadsheets repeated the £4 million figure in 2002. Shawcross acknowledged debts and royal subsidies in 2009 without specifying the exact figure or mechanism, and the claim has been cited as established fact ever since. The chain is coherent. It isn't independently audited. That distinction matters for anyone examining this with precision, and it's what every previous account has declined to explain. One piece of structural analysis does exist on the public record, and it's more useful than any of the raw numbers. The Guardian's April 2002 estate analysis noted that in 1994, a trust had been established, placing approximately £19 million, described as about 2/3 of the Queen Mother's personal wealth at that time, into a structure for her descendants, partly for inheritance tax purposes. The Guardian's analysis states that this trust probably partly accounted for the Queen Mother's overdraft with the royal bankers Coutts. The logic is straightforward. By locking away the majority of her liquid assets in a trust structure, the Queen Mother reduced her available capital, making ongoing reliance on overdraft credit more necessary to fund day-to-day expenditure. The trust was designed for her descendants, not for her operational costs. Those costs still had to be met. This brings us to 1993, the year in the title, and the reason it belongs there. In November 1992, Queen Elizabeth II described the year as her annus horribilis. Windsor Castle burned in November, the Prince and Princess of Wales separated, the Duke and Duchess of York separated, and public debate about royal finances reached a sustained pitch. In November 1992, the Queen announced she would voluntarily pay income tax from the following April and would refund to the Treasury the parliamentary annuities paid to most members of the royal family. The implementing Hansard debate took place on 11 February 1993. The relevant government statement confirmed that from 1 April 1993, the Queen would reimburse to the Consolidated Fund the cost of parliamentary annuities for most royals. And then it stated explicitly what the exception was. Only the annuities paid to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother and to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh will continue as a direct charge on the Consolidated Fund. That sentence is the structural fact the 1993 date is there to mark. The reform of 1993, the tax payment, the reimbursement of other royal annuities, was presented as a significant rationalization of royal public finances. It was. But the Queen Mother's annuity was explicitly preserved outside it. After April 1993, the Queen Mother's £643,000 remained a taxpayer charge on the Consolidated Fund. Every other working royal except the Duke of Edinburgh had their annuity costs covered by the Queen from private income. The Queen Mother's position was uniquely intact. She was, structurally, receiving more direct public support than any other royal except the sovereign and her consort. Yet the gap between that support and her actual expenditure was, according to every available account, growing. The public debate of 1992 and 1993 produced some scrutiny of royal finances generally. The 1993 reforms addressed the visible pressure points and left the Queen Mother's arrangement undisturbed. Her comptroller, Sir Alistair Aird, who in 1993 combined that role with private secretary following Gilead's death, was managing a household whose public funding had been confirmed and whose actual costs continued to exceed it. What happened to the shortfall between 1993 and 2002 isn't documented in a way that allows a specific answer. The claim that the Queen regularly transferred money from her private resources to cover the Queen Mother's expenses is widely repeated, and William Shawcross, who had full access to the Queen Mother's personal letters and diaries, appears to have characterized the Queen as covering racing losses and other expenses. That is what the Telegraph's coverage of the biography states. Whether that coverage reflects ongoing regular transfers, ad hoc contributions at moments of particular pressure, or a single settlement within the estate structure after her death isn't specified by any accessible source. The Queen's private income is primarily the Duchy of Lancaster, a portfolio of urban and rural estates. Sir Michael Peat, who became Keeper of the Privy Purse in 1996, would have administered that income. Any private subsidy flowing from the Queen to the Queen Mother's household would, structurally, have passed through the Privy Purse machinery. No statement from Peat about any such arrangement has been located. At the Queen Mother's death on 30 March 2002, Buckingham Palace confirmed under pressure that she had bequeathed her entire estate, described as consisting mainly of the contents of her houses, to the Queen. The press estimated that estate at £50 to £70 million, including art, furniture, jewelry, and other assets. Under the 1993 tax agreement, no inheritance tax was payable on that bequest. Whether the overdraft, whatever its exact figure, was cleared from within the estate assets before the bequest was formalized, or required a separate injection of the Queen's private funds, or had already been reduced by contributions during her lifetime, isn't documented in the public legal or parliamentary record. The will remains sealed. The probate accounts aren't publicly available. It's a common move, at this point in the story, to treat the lack of documentation as suspicious. It isn't a move this account is going to make. The sealing of royal wills is standard practice for senior royals, applied consistently. The absence of an audited overdraft figure in the public record reflects the structure of private banking, not a cover-up. What can be said with confidence is that a debt almost certainly existed, that it was almost certainly absorbed within the estate settlement or through arrangements made during her lifetime, and that the mechanism isn't on the public record. Tom Quinn, in Backstairs Billy, describes the Queen Mother as hugely in debt at the time of her death, while flagging that his sources are newspaper reports. The Guardian described the figure in 2002 as reported, not confirmed. The authorized biographer acknowledged the debts and the royal subsidy without publishing a balance sheet. The BBC, Time, and the Daily Telegraph repeated the £4 million figure through the 2000s and into the 2020s, each time tracing it to what was reported rather than audited. The figure has achieved a kind of solidity by repetition that its evidentiary basis does not quite support, and simultaneously, the mechanism that produced and sustained it has never been examined in print. That mechanism wasn't secretive. It was bureaucratic. It was the ordinary operation of a semi-autonomous royal household, a controller responsible for 3 residences, 60-odd domestic staff, an entertaining schedule, and a budget that required supplementation from somewhere. It was a private secretary managing correspondence that included letters to the Treasury and, apparently, from a racing owner to her treasurer. It was a page of the backstairs who knew the household better than anyone and said nothing about its finances publicly, ever. It was an institution, not a conspiracy, not a dramatic concealment, but a functioning household administering accounts that couldn't balance, in the way that institutions do, through adjustment, deferral, and the assumption that the shortfall will be absorbed. The 1959 Financial Times had already flagged a financial crisis that year that threatened public humiliation. That was 43 years before her death. The pattern, expenditure exceeding provision, arrangements made to continue, wasn't a late development. It was the operating condition of the household across its entire life. What changed in 1993 wasn't the Queen Mother's finances. What changed was the public conversation around royal money and the structural decision to exempt her from the reform that touched everyone else. Her annuity stayed on the consolidated fund. Her household kept its scale. Her controller, now combining two senior roles in one person, kept the arrangement running. The country's patience with royal expenditure was narrowing. The specific arrangements at Clarence House weren't part of any public examination. She died on 30 March 2002, 50 years and a few weeks after she had moved into Clarence House, aged 101. The annuity of £643,000 ceased that day. The estate passed to the Queen, tax-free. The figure circulating in the press, £4 million at Coutts, reported first by a Sunday tabloid in 1999, repeated in every broadsheet by April 2002, had already become the number the story was told by. But the number isn't the story. The number is the total of 50 years of small arrangements, made by named people in a building on the Mall, managing an institution whose costs consistently exceeded its income, and whose continuation was never in doubt. Sir Alistair Aird held the controller and private secretary roles simultaneously from 1993 until the day she died. He was the person whose job definition explicitly covered her homes, her staff, and her entertaining. He was the person who, in Brian Hoey's account, made active decisions about what the household could and couldn't fund. He managed the correspondence, the diary, the suppliers, and the residences. There is no published statement from him about any of it. She waved from the balcony for 50 years of widowhood, and the country loved her for it. And the country was also, in a sense it never examined, helping to pay for the view. Not in the crude way people mean when they say it, in the ordinary way. An establishment maintained, staff employed, accounts kept, invoices entered. And somewhere in that building, a member of the household holding a telephone and finding a form of words for a supplier who had been waiting since spring. That is what spending beyond your means looks like when you aren't an ordinary person. It does not look like ruin. It looks like everyone else absorbing it quietly and continuing to smile at the front of the house. The figure that gets quoted after her death is the least useful thing about this story, because a figure is just a total. What matters is the decades of small arrangements that added up to it, and the people whose job was to make each one of them go away. If you want more stories like this, the machinery behind the headlines, the named people doing the quiet work, subscribe. There are more of them.